Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share urban legend horror stories. First story. This story was shared by you/quote_the_raven_. Somewhere in Mexico, an urban legend. My grandmother is from a small desert town in Mexico that she refuses to tell us the name of, to this day. She tells me and my cousins that she will never reveal her hometown's name, for fear of the darkness it holds. My cousins and I were always very creeped out by her story. All that she will ever tell us about her hometown is an urban legend that she swears is a true story. This urban legend is based on a supposedly true story that happened when my grandmother was still living in the town, and she was told the details by a church official in town one evening when she and a few other people inquired about what was going on at the local convent. A few of the nuns fled the convent around that time, and they detailed the events. They were privy to details no one else was regarding what happened in those days, and told the church official before leaving town. The church official told my grandmother and the other concerned townsfolk the whole story as he heard it from the nuns that were there, and this is how that story goes. Somewhere in Mexico there was a little convent that has long since been abandoned by the church. Once a small yet prideful little monument of Catholicism in Mexico, it was now an abandoned relic from years past. In the early 70s a few nuns brought a lost boy into this convent, who they called Pietro. No one knows why they chose that name for him. Pietro had been a mystery since he first arrived in the town. He was first spotted in rags, wandering in the desert, a pack of coyotes following him from a distance. He kept turning in circles, asking out loud in Italian, "Dove mia madre?" or "Where is my mother?" This being a tiny desert town somewhere in Mexico, Italian was not a language many people spoke. The only person who spoke anything other than Spanish and/or English was an abbess or head nun at the local convent. On the day the boy first arrived in town, a group of the townspeople kept track of the boy wandering the desert from a distance and called for one of the local church officials to investigate. The church official took a group of nuns out to the boy and eventually would bring him back into town. The boy looked to be around 8 or 9 years old. He was typically very quiet and wore a light scowl on his face almost permanently, his skin brown and dried by the sun, his eyes dark and piercing. The boy was uncooperative with the nuns. All he would ever do is ask repeatedly, "Dove mia madre?" Naturally, since the boy's only spoken words were in Italian, the head nun of the convent, who was fluent in Italian, French, English, Spanish and Latin, was the only one who conversed with the boy. Astonishingly, during one of her early attempts to get the boy to give her information regarding his origins, she discovered that the boy was also fluent in Italian, French, English, and Spanish. Later, she would discover he knew Latin as well. The head nun said she first discovered he knew multiple languages because the boy would sometimes sing French, Spanish, and even English nursery rhymes while they sat together. She discovered his knowledge of Latin when he was caught on multiple occasions reciting prayers in Latin while he roamed the convent halls. Sometime later the nuns were reported as saying it wasn't the fact that he was praying in Latin that disturbed them, it was that they did not know what he was praying to, because his prayers were not of Christian origin. The conversations between the head nun and the boy were nothing special. The boy refused to answer questions. No matter what language the nun would use, the boy would confirm he understood what she was asking, respond a little bit in whatever language she spoke to him, and then abruptly replied, "Dove mia madre?" The nuns were at a loss at what to do with the child, but the head nun was insistent that they simply keep the child and raise him in the name of God. She was convinced he was a blessing from God to the nuns for being obedient, loyal servants of the church. At night when all the nuns were supposed to be sleeping, he could be overheard singing from his little room next to the kitchen. The little boy who chose to communicate mostly in Italian, if at all, would sing in fluent French, the French folk song, Au clair de la lune. Over and over, until around 3 a.m. where he would fall silent and the lights in his room would go out. None of the nuns besides the head nun dared ever to enter the boy's room. The 7 lower-ranking nuns grew quite frightened of him. He wasn't normal, he had an eerie air to him. He would stare at the nuns during their prayers. He refused to convert to Catholicism but would often recite any prayers the nuns uttered in Latin and sometimes an exotic language the nuns did not understand. The head nun, the most learned of them, told her sisters that the unknown language he spoke sounded like it could be some form of ancient Coptic. The other nuns of the convent grew weary of how unsettled the boy made them, and one night, 3 of the nuns decided enough was enough. This child was no blessing, he only brought negative feelings and frightened them. The 3 nuns with the most courage snuck into the kitchen one night. All 3 came together and walked through the kitchen and stopped just short of the hallway leading into the boy's room, and they looked on and listened. Huddled together the nuns saw the flickering of candlelight emanate from beneath his door, then they heard his singing of Au clair de la lune softly sound off from the other side of his door as well. All 3 of them said a quick prayer, then they walked down the hallway towards his room, hand in hand. The singing grew a bit louder with each step, and the flickering of the candlelight from beneath the door seemed to look more like a raging fire. The first nun to reach the door took a deep breath, looked back at her sisters with fear in her heart, and slowly opened the door. As she began opening, the singing stopped immediately, the candle went out, and a small bit of childlike chuckling emanated from the room. The moonlight shined from a window in the room and was now the only source of light there within. The nuns were in pure terror, yet they did not scream. They were in shock and looked about the room for the source of the child's laughter, when one of the nuns spotted a pair of child's eyes beneath the bed. This time one of them did give out a small yelp in terror. The boy just stayed under the bed with only his eyes faintly visible and chuckled at them. Then he asked in a sickeningly sweet tone, "Dove mia madre?" The nuns huddled together, and in Spanish one of them replied, "Your mother is not here, we will take you to her if you'd like." That night those 3 nuns told their sisters what they witnessed and left with the boy into the desert, illuminated by moonlight, never to be heard from again. My grandmother would go on to tell us also, in the years since that night, the convent lost support from the church, and was abandoned. The head nun from back when they found the boy was sick with guilt. She knew her decision to keep the boy lead to the disappearance and possible deaths of her sisters. The old head nun eventually took her own life. The town around the convent grew a bit larger with time, and sometime during the late 80s, the town's only pay phone would ring repeatedly from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m., and if you ever dared answer it you would hear a small chuckle on the other end and be asked by the voice of a child, "Dove mia madre?" before the line hangs up. It was the source of some tourist buzz for a while, but by the mid-90s the small little town was ravaged by gang violence and corruption leaking out from the bigger cities around the area. That payphone was eventually gone, and the calls stopped altogether. However, one night, in the mid-90s, 3 local kids were playing around in the old convent when one of them spotted a red piece of thread sticking out of the bottom of a window sill. The boys pulled the thread up and followed it. It led out of the convent out into the desert. The red thread was inexplicably long and kept going and going, continuously pulling up from the sand as they pulled on it, following its path. Eventually the path ended at a giant hill of desert sand. Unsatisfied with the hill being the end point of the thread, the boys tugged on the thread as hard as they could until it yanked out of the dirt hill. Upon yanking the thread formed the hill, the sand from the hill slowly cascaded down, and after a while a large stone monument could be seen. It turned out to be a mausoleum, in the middle of the desert. The mausoleum door was open, and inside, with what little sunlight pierced the darkness of the mausoleum, you could see 5 corpses. There were 3 corpses on the floor face down in an almost prostrating pose facing the 2 other corpses. At the far end of the mausoleum was a stone throne. In the throne, just barely visible, sat a very large corpse, adorned in a gold crown, emerald necklaces, and ruby diamond rings, and a tattered velvety red Victorian-era dress, and in her lap sat a smaller corpse, a corpse of a child, adorned with rags, clutching in his hand the other end of the red thread that the boys had been following that whole time. The boys reportedly were frightened, but continued to stare into the mausoleum until they heard a small voice echo from inside say in Italian, "Dove tua madre?" or "Where is your mother?" The boys fled the site and reported it to local officials, but nothing came of it. The boys were said to have gone back, but could never find the mausoleum again without the string. And the story is so weird, but the way my grandmother tells it in Spanish is just petrifying. LOL. All that's left of this urban legend is what the elders of that small town in Mexico agree to say. They do warn though, if you are ever in a small desert town in Mexico, and come upon a piece of red thread that leads seemingly out to nowhere, don't follow it, never, ever, follow it. Second story. This story was shared by you/Cosmchushzone. The Slender Man. The things Sandra saw in the woods that day would stay with her for a long time. Had she known this beforehand, she still would have taken the shortcut that ended up taking longer than expected. Had she not, she would remain ignorant of the truth of his fate, though the outcome would still end with the cool tendril slowly working its way around her neck. It was because of a high school bully named Kenneth that 13-year-old Laia Gabetza was in the hospital. However, no one dared tell the officials that fact. Even if the assailant went to jail, his attack would certainly lead to him tried as an adult. His brothers would still be around to pick up the family business, a morbid nickname, but fitting. And their business acumen would probably be just a little more discreet. Such was the way children lived in the small town. Had Sandra been older, she would probably nut up and just tell the friggin' cops and get it over with, but alas. A girl of 7 who still carried a bunny rabbit doll in her backpack wouldn't be very intimidating in such a situation as facing the twin terrors. Said doll was in her arms as she traversed the woods, a shortcut to the hospital and a much overdue visit with Laia. She wasn't afraid, as her grandmother, when she was still alive and able to walk, would often take her on walks through the trees, and the child memorized every path. It didn't hurt that the doll she held was made by her grandmother, helping her to imagine that those past days were still alive. However, her memories were unaccustomed to the muted humming that filled the air, nor the silence of all birds and insects that usually sang their melodies at that point of the day. Sandra didn't even see him until she was a mere yard away. He blended with the trees with scary efficiency. She could even dismiss the bloody carcass as a bird's nest, a bloody bird's nest, she berated herself in hindsight, in the branches. It took her a few moments to realize that trees generally don't wear black business suits, nor do they carry mangled bodies with gaping faces that looked oh so very much like Kenneth. She had no clue why she was unable to shout, but her feet still worked. Stumbling backwards, her doll slipped from her hands and onto the grass. She didn't dare step forward to retrieve it, gazing at the terrifying figure from behind her dirty blonde bangs, glittering green eyes wide with amazement. The creature took no notice of the little girl, focusing instead on the task of skewering the remains on a tall branch. As he worked, Sandra looked him over. The man was inhumanly tall, easily 3 times her size, and clothed in a black suit. His arms were long and slender, ending in tapered fingers with no discernible nails. His lanky form was accompanied by numerous black tendrils that may have originated from his upper back, though it was hard to tell. However, these extra appendages were nothing compared to his face. His head was pure ivory, not a strand of hair to mar the smooth, almost glowing skin, while his featureless face bore no clue to his purpose, nor his origin. By all accounts, the man was an abomination. For some reason, though, Sandra felt no fear. Her instincts were nevertheless engaged in a civil war. Half of her wanted to run, the other half knew it was certainly a futile effort. His task finally finished, with Kenneth impaled there in all his glory, Sandra had realized at one point during the procedure that his organs had been removed and reinserted in plastic bags. She had no idea what the purpose of that might have been. The man noticed his observer for the first time. Looking at her, though he had no eyes, she was certain he could see. For several hushed minutes, his gaze dropped to the bunny. Stepping forward, despite his size, he was unnaturally graceful. He delicately picked the doll up. Bending to the girl's eye level, he handed the stuffed animal out to her. Without breaking eye contact, she took it back from him. As he stood and turned to leave, she called out to him. "Hey!" He turned back. "Can you show me the way to the hospital?" Sandra knew the way, and had a feeling he was aware of that. She simply wanted more time to figure out what exactly the thing was. He apparently understood her request, and didn't seem to mind, though she sensed he was just a little surprised that she wasn't terrified. He took her little hand in his, and began walking in the right direction. She noticed his hand was neither cold nor warm, smooth nor rough. It just felt wrong. As if he wasn't supposed to exist, but did anyway. After a few silent minutes, they arrived where the woods ended, across from a playground outside the hospital. Due to the rains of the previous week, the area was free of screaming children. Sandra wordlessly released the tall man's hand, heading past the abandoned park to the hospital doors. She never looked back at him. Kenneth was reported missing later that night. Within the next few days, his deformed corpse was found in the tree. Terrified, his brothers told the police everything, from his torment of the children to the attack on Laya. Concerned by their daughter's sudden change in personality, where she was once bright and outgoing, she now rarely spoke, an introverted personality springing up almost overnight. Sandra's parents moved from state to state, trying to find a psychiatrist who could explain what could cause such a troubling change. 9 years later, they were killed in a car accident that left her half blind. Her bunny had seemingly disappeared from the seat next to her, and her frantic searching drew her father's attention away from an oncoming truck. With no other family, Laya, now 23, took her in, and the teenager returned to her old town. After a few days, Laya noticed something strange, later insisting Sandra visit the hospital's newest psychiatrist, a young man named Matthew Rydell, fresh out of college at age 27. He had been a good friend to Laya in high school, and Sandra's babysitter. The son of the police chief, he was intelligent and quite fond of the two young women. On the 10-year anniversary of Kenneth's murder, Sandra obliged. Asterisk. As the son of an officer investigating the case, Matt had learned ghastly details about the crime that weren't released to the general public. He had never told anyone, especially the young girl he had so often babysit. Now said girl was back, and the changes to her appearance were shocking. Her once wavy, lighter hair was now a deeper brown in a long, straight ponytail, thinner as well. Her eyes had faded to a dull jade. Her right eye had been cut in the accident, leaving 2 slashes shaped like index, originating from the center of her pupil extending slightly past the iris. Though the eye was now worthless, she downright refused to have it removed, or to wear an eye patch. Instead, she used special eye drops to ward off infection. Her skin had paled from years of limited sunlight and harsh electric light in the hospitals, and while her body had changed to the usual feminine curves, she was slim and tall, seeming almost malnourished, though he knew both her parents and Laya would shoot themselves before letting her skip a meal. Matt had expected her to talk about her sadness over the loss of her parents, or how much she hated being moved across the country so much. Instead, she walked in, looked him in the eyes, and said, "I know who killed Kenneth." As she began her story, he was certain she was joking. Noting the honesty in her voice, he began fearing for her sanity. However, she then mentioned details unreleased, such as the plastic bags. She noted that his heart kept falling out, and the frustrated, slender man finally shoved it in the body's mouth. That was where it was found. That, along with the placing of the body in no footprints, tire tracks, or imprints from a ladder, convinced him that she was sane and truthful. When she finished, he suspended his doubts to ask her a few questions. So, he was protecting the children. A punisher, maybe? Sandra laughed. Neither. And definitely not for food. The whole body was there. And last I checked, Kenny Boy didn't grow tentacles, so he doesn't do it for reproductive purposes. As I know, Slendy's the only one out there. Which isn't all that comforting. So, did he do that for fun? She snorted. Please, Matt. It's not like he's evil. He'd probably feel insulted. Noting his look of confusion, she explained. That wasn't the only time I saw him. He's been loitering out my window for the last 10 years. I still have no clue what the hell he is, or where he's from, but what I do know is why he does it. Because he can. Matthew shuddered, and before he could ask anything else, she glanced at the window behind him, and swore under her breath. As she marched over, he turned to see what was going on, then yelped, falling out of his chair. The blank face was waiting outside, one pale hand tapping the glass. Sandra yanked it open, then bopped the creature on the head. Damn it, man, do you want to cause a panic? We don't want civilian attention, and if one person in this hospital sees you, the cops'll come, and then I'll be forced to rip off a tentacle. Do not make me break out Mr. Blender again. Matt watched the exchange in shock. If it wasn't so downright horrifying, the girl's rant would have been hilarious. One thin arm reached in, displaying a bottle of eye drops. Taking it, Sandra muttered something incomprehensible before using them. When she finished, she handed them back. "Kay, tall, pale and freakish, get thee gone. I dunno, go find a coke dealer in the city and impale him on a street lamp, just don't make a scene." As the man headed off, Matt stumbled to the window, flinching when he saw that he was already gone. So he just follows you around? High up. Pretty smart guy, can write and understand English, but doesn't see to understand spacing. I think he just follows me because he's curious. He doesn't understand why I was never afraid of him. Why weren't you afraid? It's useless to fear the inevitable, Maddie. Confused, he looked at her. What's the inevitable? Sandra grinned enigmatically, before glancing at the clock. Well, time's up document. She picked up her bag and headed for the door, ignoring his protests. Before she left, she turned back. Oh, and Leah told me to invite you to dinner tomorrow. Probably to discuss Slendy, maybe she's just crushing on you. Bye. With that, she was gone. Asterisk. The rains had sent the children scurrying to their homes, setting the stage for a quiet, anticlimactic resolution. The gentle mist rising from the playground mirrored the scenery from 10 years earlier, the only change being the young woman slowly swinging. Though there were no audible footsteps, she could hear the ever-present noise, a low, distant hum. Sighing, Sandra addressed the figure. It's been 10 years. You can't hold it off any longer. The hum moved closer. You know more than enough to get by without me. And I left the note up on the computer, with all the requests we agreed to. She'll find it soon, so you have to do it now. So do it. A low drone now. I was never afraid. I don't understand it either. I just, kinda grew to expect you there. And, well, despite your nature, I guess I grew to respect you. But never fear. Hell, the only time I've been afraid the past 10 years was during the accident. A tendril appeared at her shoulder, slowly curling around her pale, pretty neck. She smiled. It still didn't feel right, as if it didn't belong in her world. However, over the years, she had gotten used to it. I know I didn't leave that rabbit doll behind. It was right next to me when I last saw it. I wonder where it went. A small, plush object landed in her lap. Picking it up, she squinted in the low light. It was the doll. She gaped in disbelief, finally comprehending. Despite the implications, however, she smirked. Off in the distance, she heard police sirens start up, as if a terrified woman just called in that her friend never came home from a doctor's appointment, and that she just found her will on the computer. The tentacle gently applied pressure. Well played, you son of a bitch. Well played. Third story. This story was shared by you/Hazeltons. The Durham House. I live in a small city in Pennsylvania, and like every other place in the world, there are plenty of urban legends being passed around and retold in different fashions. A particular legend fascinated me and seemed to keep finding its way into my thoughts. A house that people refer to as the Durham House sits on a windy, terribly paved street just past a farm on Funk Mill Road. The story is that the house, with a mother and children inside, lit on fire in the dead of winter. The father, who got word of the house being ablaze, rushed home and his car slid on ice, causing a fatal accident. The entire family died that night. As the legend goes, if you visit the house at night you might see the father driving up the street and inevitably crashing, or the ghosts of the poor mother and children in the ruins of the house. This place has been known to attract teenagers who want to get a good scare or just need an abandoned place to party. I was one of the teenagers that went there for a good scare. On a warm, still summer night, a few friends and I, having nothing to do, decided to make our way to the Durham House. None of us had ever been there before, so it was a bit hard to find at first, but we eventually stumbled upon it. Just the sight of the house sent shivers up my spine. We parked the car and crept through the darkness to the ruins of the house. The place was as creepy and decrepit as you'd expect a supposedly haunted, burned-down house to be. We walked around the house, as much as we could considering its state, grasping each other for dear life and purposely freaking each other out. We didn't see anything strange, and the only fear we felt was created by our own minds. However, I did find a crumpled up piece of notebook paper somewhere in the ruins. I opened it up and shined our flashlight on it. It read, in what looked like a young child's shitty handwriting, "Daddy, Daddy, fly away home, your house is on fire and your children are gone, all except one, and that's little Ann, for she crept under the frying pan." I'm nearly positive I still have this paper somewhere. I'll try to find it and post it here. It definitely creeped us out enough to run back to the car and book it out of there. Collapsing into the seats of the car, we all laughed about how silly we were and how some other kids, probably the idiots in the video I posted above, made that and left it there to scare someone else. On the drive back, we studied the piece of paper and I tried to freak my friends out even more by making up an elaborate story and telling it with the straightest face I could manage. I told them that there was a child named Ann that lived in the house and that many people claimed to see her ghost at the ruins. I also said that several people claimed that the ghost of Ann would follow them home. When I got home that night, I googled the rhyme on the paper we found, as it looked familiar to me. It's a really popular nursery rhyme, except "daddy" was substituted for the word ladybug. I turned the paper over and nearly shit my pants. The name Molly was written in the same chicken scratch handwriting as the nursery rhyme. Molly is my name. That was not there when I found the note. Part of me figured that one of my friends did that to mess with me, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something really weird was going on. Scared shitless, I called my then boyfriend on Skype and told him about my night. Not to my surprise, he laughed and told me not to let it freak me out so much, as ghosts aren't real and blah blah blah. At some point during the call, he said that he saw my 7-year-old sister run down the hallway, past my door. This was a little weird since it was past midnight, but she'd ignore the bedtime rules pretty often, so I yelled behind me, "Cassie, get back in bed." Not long after, I powered down my laptop and prepared to get what was sure to be a terrible night's sleep. I checked my sister's room to make sure she was in bed. She wasn't. That's when I remembered that my parents and my sister were in Maine visiting my grandmother for the weekend. My sister had not been in the house all day. I locked all the doors and windows, ran to my bed, NOP'd out loud, and pulled the covers over my head until I fell asleep. I very rarely remember my dreams, but the nightmare I had that night was so vivid that I woke up believing it really happened. I was back at the house, alone this time, and I was watching a little girl sitting on what was left of the staircase, staring back at me. She kept saying, "Play with me," and giggling. She rolled a red kickball to me, and I rolled it back to her. She then got up and ran toward my body and didn't stop. She ran right through me. That's when I woke up covered in sweat. My right hand was clutching a pen. It was 2 a.m., I'd only been asleep for about an hour. I reached over and turned on the lamp next to my bed. Sitting next to me was an open notebook. The words, "Play with me," were written on the page. In my handwriting. Moments later, a red ball rolled into my door from the darkness of the hallway. Fourth story. This story was shared by u/Lou_NS. I wish I never listened to my school's urban legends. I'm sure any student has heard scary stories spread by their peers. Folklore, if you will, maintained so well that the students from a decade ago could have told a similar tale. When I was in public school, it was Bloody Mary or some other spirit trapped in the confines of the hallways. However, After my parents decided to send me across the world to an English boarding school, the stories got a lot worse. As the school dated back to the late 17th century, the older urban legends still managed an influence in the study body. In fact, most stories revolved around a caste of nobility that many swore roamed the halls centuries ago. There were three princes, Ives, Elias, and Madoc, who, similarly to Greek mythology, governed a unique association. But in the twist that naturally came with childish horror, each prince held this relation with something dark and sinister, something that could be used to scare fellow classmates with. Thus, Ives was known as the Prince of Blood, Elias, the Prince of the Unknown, and Madoc, the Prince of Suffering. Tales of Ives, Elias and Madoc were spread as quickly as gossip, and many new additions to their already plentiful foundation were welcome. It became generally accepted that Ives and Madoc disdained their brother, Elias, and after school one evening, set him on fire. However, some still maintained that Elias was alive, and thrived in the unexplored forest surrounding the school, pulling in stray children to feed his brother, Ives. After a while, the stories seemed to become more ridiculous, and as I grew older, implausible. It was one of the things you lose growing up, a childish acceptance of your peers' stories, and by the age of 17, I had forgotten all about Ives, Elias, and Madoc, spare the occasional tale that was passed on by the younger students. The thought only recently re-entered my head after the disappearance of my classmate, Ian. Having vanished after an outing to the nearby town, many deterred from the teacher's plausible explanations to the more familiar, urban legends. It didn't take long before a story was spread. Ian was captured by Elias, a younger student explained to me while waiting in the cafeteria line. He's being tortured to satisfy his brothers, Ives and Madoc. If you look out your windows at midnight, you will see the three princes running around the school, searching for any more foolish, unsuspecting pupils. While I brushed off the story, Ian's disappearance never received any further details. Weeks followed without a trace, until one night, when I was up late to study. It was dark outside, and had been so for hours. I was on my laptop when suddenly a scream broke from outside. I stood up in my chair to look out the window, only to find a naked man running from the tree line and onto the main trail that led to the dormitory's back entrance. I made my way to the hallway, where I found a handful of other students peering their heads out of their doorways, looking at each other for an explanation. A group promptly formed to investigate. I followed them as they made their way slowly downstairs. I could still hear Ian screaming from outside, banging his hand against the wall. Once we made it to the front entrance, Ian's knocks had made it to the front entrance. We opened the door without hesitation. The boy ran inside like a wounded animal, bruised and naked, clutching himself from the cold. Ian was still screaming, and pointed to the door, as if he was trying to warn us. Just as he started to run to the corner of the room, the front door slowly creaked open, and we all looked up to see three dark figures, just far enough to be engulfed in shadows. I turned to face back to the stairs, but instead, I was outside, with the rest of my group and Ian. The figures strayed outside the darkness then, and I was now staring at the faces of men described endlessly in my youth. But while the stories described Ives, Elias and Madoc as cunning, the things in front of me could be no further from it. They shared no familial features, and instead, their faces were similar to serious burn victims. The rest of their bodies were wrapped in white, blood-stained sheets, which fell around their feet in dirty brown billows. The worst part about them was that there was nothing to distinguish one from the others. I took a moment to face each prince, as I could have either been looking at the Prince of Suffering, the Prince of Blood, or the prince of the unknown. The ambiguity frightened me, so I turned back to my group, and found that they too were looking at one another. After an eternity, the princes finally moved, and in a moment, they have surrounded us. When another moment passed, they moved again, this time, towards us, and we were left to run into the woods, away from the school. I ran as fast as I possibly could. I found Ian next to me, who, despite wearing no shoes, was able to maintain a steady distance from the princes. I kept my eye on him until he suddenly motioned for me to come to him, and we split from the group and hid behind a tree. After a minute of silence, the princes made their way past us. But instead of 3 before, there were only 2 then. I brushed it off after I noticed that, unlike the rest of my group, they walked slowly, waiting for them to slow down and grow weak. Ian kept his finger to his lips until he decided that we have gone undetected. What the fuck was that? I asked Ian, who kept his eyes on the distant trees. But he didn't respond, and instead, stayed put until I was forced to leave him to run back to the school. Once I returned, I found the dorms eerily still. Now, I stand in the darkness only after finding the door had been left strangely open, and the lights inside left off. I call up to the rooms, but I receive no response. I slowly make my way upstairs, and once I reach the top, bile climbs my throat. Pale bodies dot the hallway, each one covered in bruises and cuts. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/Linata Daroki. Unsavory Urban Exploration. Hi. My name is Lena, and I just want to talk about my urban exploration experience that I did with a group of friends. There were 4 experienced individuals, and 1 beginner, whom we'll call C, D, M, and CH. We were intrigued by the tales of an abandoned psychiatric asylum. Despite the rumors surrounding this gloomy, dilapidated place, broken windows, medicine and water bottles completely shattered, and a few drops and traces of blood on the walls. It was pitch black, and the asylum had been abandoned for 10 to 15 years next to a facility for disabled children, also abandoned for about 5 years. The rumors spoke of completely insane individuals, like cannibal serial killers, scenes of torture, and mistreatment of patients, nothing pleasant but quite usual for urban exploration or urban legends. We only had our torches to illuminate our way, for flashlights, and a lantern since one of our friends couldn't afford much else, so we placed it in the middle for his safety. We'd encountered a few violent individuals before. My friend D and I have been practicing boxing for 18 years, although we've never really needed to defend ourselves, we knew what to do. Besides, my buddy and I were quite muscular for young adults, appearing rather intimidating with our size and build resembling MMA pros. The other friends brought a pocket knife and weren't as intimidating as the rumors described because they were just regular folks. There were only rooms. The only slightly eerie detail was a straitjacket stained with blood. But let's get back to our urban exploration. We continued to search room by room, shining our lights into each area before entering. Room after room yielded nothing of interest, so M began to tell horror stories and the rumors about the place and its surroundings to keep the mood going. Even though the place was eerie, it wasn't so frightening with all the childish graffiti around. Then, we entered a room and saw an animal corpse, a big one like a deer or a large boar, but the body was still fresh, blood oozing, and the entrails out, surrounded by more or less fresh bloodstains. The room itself was a mix of unsettling photographs and dried blood splatters. We were on the verge of vomiting at the sight. Then, we saw a guy crouched down, a knife in hand covered in blood, torn clothes also soaked in blood. We decided to leave, but Dee and I decided to cover our friends, so we let them go. The guy slowly turned his head, his mouth covered in blood, and said, "I see my feast has arrived," with a wide smile and a completely terrifying laugh. My friend told me to leave, but I couldn't. I was frozen in a mix of fear and disgust. I saw him stand up and slowly approach. What brought me back to my senses was a sharp pain on the right side of my face, and I couldn't see anything from that side anymore. The guy had gouged out my eye. Understanding this and losing blood, I passed out. I woke up in the hospital with my friends and girlfriend crying beside me. The wound was deep and nearly fatal, with a 5% chance of survival. To this day, I wear an eye patch to cover the gaping hole where my eye used to be. As for the guy, he was truly insane, medically certified, and locked up again for cannibalism. He was severely injured by Dee while trying to protect me. Due to the trauma and my disability, I never ventured into urban exploration again. My girlfriend moved in with me because I feared encountering that guy again, even though I know he's locked up for good. I don't go out at night alone anymore, at least my girlfriend and Dee, who's my roommate, are with me. The others recovered better than me and still engage in urban exploration, but they avoid hospitals or similar places. Only Dee has a bit of trouble because he also narrowly escaped death for me, and for that, I'll be grateful forever for not abandoning me to my fate. My girlfriend told me she absolutely wants him to witness our marriage if we ever have one. Sixth story. This story was shared by you/haunting Narwhal 6071. Do not go camping in the Catskills wilderness. Do not go camping in the Catskills wilderness. The Catskill Mountains in New York are stunning. Through their beauty, I am here to tell you that looks can be deceiving. I always enjoyed the drive through the Catskills when I was a kid. My calling to explore the mysterious nature gave me a sense of awe. It was a place I felt true inner peace. Once I could drive myself, I found myself taking consistent weekend camping and ski trips. My excitement for the unknown only grew. I became less fearful and more curious. This was my biggest mistake. I found myself driving into the heart of the mountains in uninhabited areas, camping all alone. This new arrangement worked for a while and I was happy with the new experience, so I stuck with it. My weekend trips became frequent, and I was camping every week. Now, I don't want to bother you with details, but this story was when I was camping with my friend Frank. Frank and I had been friends in high school and remained friends throughout college. During winter break, we decided we would go on a 3-day camping trip in a new area, the Big Indian Wilderness. There are many urban legends of the Catskills, all of them fake, or so I thought. The biggest urban legend of the area was the Gullhound. This sounds weird. A slim figure that walks on 4 stick-like legs, sharp spines on its back, and a growl that could turn even the bravest of people pale. The worst part about this creature, its face. It was made of 2 ovals that crossed together. Going horizontal were its eyes, going vertical, its mouth of razor-sharp teeth. I had never experienced anything that really scared me in any of my camping trips, even the solo ones. The usual bears and raccoons came and went, usually scavenging for some of my leftover food. I always carried bear mace with me and a variety of knives just in case a bear got a little too curious, but nothing could have prepared me for this trip. I had to stop for gas when we got into a little town outside of the Big Indian Wilderness area. I noticed the cashier of the store staring at me with concern in his eyes, and this set an uneasy feeling inside my whole body. Now, what happened next is, to say the least, cliché. I went to check out and I decided to ask the cashier if everything was alright. He gave me a weak smile and asked what I would hope he wouldn't. "Are you going into the big Indian wilderness?" he asked. My response of a simple, yes, made him pale. He went on to explain in vague detail how campers kept disappearing over the last 2 years and that we should just stay at a camping resort to protect ourselves from the Gulhound. This had Frank and I questioning if we should keep going or not. After a long discussion, we decided yes, we would keep going and enjoy the great outdoors. We weren't going to let a fake urban legend and a creepy cliché gas station cashier ruin our good time. We continued the 20-minute drive to our spot. We picked an empty valley about a 15-minute drive from the Belle-Île ski resort. The views were stunning. It was a perfect balance of quiet and close to civilization. The snowy trees coated the land, as if to keep it warm. The wind gently caressed our faces as we set up the tent, racing the light of day. My anxieties of the urban legend gently left my mind as we set up a fire and relaxed. The first night went extremely well. The tent was safe and warm, no animal sounds, and the sky was full of stars. What was strange, was the paw prints of what seemed to be an animal with 4 thin legs. This put us on edge again as we both knew how stealthy the Gulhound was. We knew we couldn't do anything about the prints, so we brushed it aside and left for our ski day. When we came back for the night, our tent was taken apart in a manner so precise that it looked as if a human had done it. Now, remember, we are off in the middle of a forest 15 minutes away from anybody by car. We had no cell service, so this was a big deal. Not a flake of snow fell from the sky that day. The unnerving part was, there were no human footprints, only more of the thin paw prints that had appeared overnight. Unfortunately, we had arrived with only 30 minutes of daylight left. This bad timing on our part made us make the decision on setting the tent back up and staying the night. We decided against lighting a fire and staying in our tent the entire night. It was around midnight when we were startled awake by the noise. A horrible tormenting noise. We looked at each other with horror. What we were hearing was what we were warned about by the cashier and what most likely took down our tent earlier in the day. This was no doubt its growl. I shot up, grabbing my bear mace within what was probably less than a second. Frank shot up slowly. I could tell I was having a fight and he was having a freeze reaction. We sat silently, not breathing for what felt like hours. I checked the time, 12:15. We waited another minute, starting to believe we were just dreaming. That was until the zipper to our tent started to unzip as the sound of breathing hovered over the tent. The zipper slowly continued down the track as if it knew what it was doing and was trying to taunt us. I grabbed my largest knife and got ready for what could be the end. The zipper ripped off its tracks and the rift stretched open. The only thing I could see was the darkness of the night. What was unusual was that the stars and moon were gone. I anticipated whatever it was to stick its horrifying face inside of the tent. But it didn't. This game went on for another 4 hours. We sat frozen, wondering if we last to see the sun rise through the horrors of the night. As the sunrise brought a red sky, we remained unable to see the creature. Finally, we heard the growl it's infamous for. The creature came from behind the tent, leaped over it, and landed facing us. Its face was warped by a sinister look in its eyes. We knew when we saw it that this creature had a lust for blood. I was not trying to become a statistic, so my next decision still shocks me to this day. I am not a large guy. I have always had a skinny build. I ran cross-country throughout high school, and I always hated football. Anyways, I found myself sprinting at this long, skinny, but tall creature. I attempted to tackle the creature knowing it would be the only way I saw the light of the new day's sun. I ran into the creature and managed to knock it down. It got up menacingly with a wide smirk across its cross-shaped face. Frank arose from the tent with an axe, and we knew this was about to be the fight of our lives. The gullhound stood up on its two hind legs. This thing was a lot larger than expected. It rose to about 9 feet tall. It ran towards us, and I got a mace spray right into its eyes. It wiped away the thick coating of what would put a human into a state of excruciating pain and smacked me across the face. As I drifted into a state of unconsciousness, a similar fate struck Frank. I was knocked out. I woke up bound, being dragged deeper into the woods. There was a whole group of gullhounds assisting the one that we had just fought in carrying us back. We were going to be breakfast if we didn't think fast. I felt a stabbing pain in my pocket and realized that I had my Swiss Army knife in my pocket. I managed to bend in a way that looked natural and I was able to grab my knife. I slowly and inconspicuously whittled away at my ropes. I freed my legs and one arm and I went to assist Frank. He was dazed and half awake, but I managed to free both of us completely. I shot up ready to fight again when I noticed something sickening. At least 25 precisely disassembled bodies of victims were put together in a mixed and matched puzzle-like way. The gullhounds froze. They stared me down and in a terrifying set of raspy, deep voices, they said in unison, "These two have managed to wake and free themselves. They have earned their freedom." They waved their hands around and we both passed out again. We woke up later in the day. My phone was dead, but the sun's position showed it was around 1 in the afternoon. We were right near our car and our camping gear was packed perfectly back to the way we packed it before we left for our trip. My keys were already inserted, and the car was started. Our fuel tank had been filled. I drove my crappy car out of there at speeds faster than I thought any car could do. When we got back to civilization in the foothills, we immediately went to a police station and told them what happened. The surprised look on the officer's face as we told him what we saw proved that he had heard this story before. He went on to explain that this was a normal report that they get around once every 2 or 3 months. As we left the police station, we saw the gullhounds waiting. They hid their slim bodies behind the trees, but it seemed as if they wanted us to recognize their presence. This is why you should never go camping in the Catskills unless you're at a resort. We drove the 2-hour drive home in complete silence except for the gasps of terror when we saw them appear on the side of the road. I went straight back to my parents' house after I dropped Frank off. I was greeted warmly and questioned about the early arrival, but I knew they wouldn't believe my story. I told them that some food we brought was spoiled and we were feeling sick so they would stop asking. All night, I heard taps on my bedroom window. I woke up in the late morning to my parents screaming at the sight of the gullhound. I write this knowing they are nearby. I have hired ghost hunters and exorcists, but nothing seems to work. I can't tell if they're sinister or innocent, but they seem to respect me for escaping. Whatever they are, I saw what they did to the people that didn't wake up and escape. This is my warning to trust the cliché gas station employee and your gut. Don't go camping anywhere in the Catskills unless you stay at a resort. This has been my warning. Come prepared if you choose to disregard it. 7th story. This story was shared by you/MammothFormal1. Never go looking for urban legends. If you're looking for a story with a happy, or otherwise fulfilling ending, I'd advise you to look elsewhere. With that being said, if you need a stern warning why we shouldn't dabble in the unknown, read on. The autumn of 1997 was an eventful time for me. For the umpteenth time, my life changed as I found myself ripped away from my friends when my family moved yet again. It was also the year I came face to face with the Witherer. This time, our destination was the suburbs of Pennsylvania. This was a welcome change from the hustle and bustle of city life. For the first time in my life, I could see trees from my window. Not just trees lining a filthy street either, but an actual forest with animals. I was a happy child growing up. I enjoyed all the perks of being from a wealthy family and made friends easily. The only common disturbance came from being moved from city to city, on account of my father's work as a sales agent. We never stayed in one place for more than a few years. Despite fitting in well, having to make new friends each time we moved proved to be an emotionally taxing task. For years, I anxiously awaited my senior year, only for disappointment to find me again. I was just getting settled into my previous school in Virginia when my parents set me down to reveal we'd be moving again. I wasn't enthused by the idea of starting over during the biggest year of my life to date. Like clockwork, I found myself being called the new kid once more. Being the new kid did have its advantages, though. For one, I was always the center of attention, at least for about a week, until gossip and rumors dispelled the shroud of mystery surrounding me. You see, you're not the new kid when everyone learns your name. To my surprise and delight, I immediately made friends with the most popular guy in the school, Charlie Rennick. Without fail, I found myself invited to all the best house parties every single weekend. Charlie loved partying, so much so it was the only thing he ever talked about. This made it even more surprising when he spent the entire lunch period nerding out and regurgitating an urban legend about a witch from the 1700s. According to Charlie, the Witherer was a soothsayer whose inaccurate fortune-telling got her beat to near death by local villagers. The hate-driven mob didn't know or care that she was pregnant, though. After her inevitable miscarriage, the sullen woman locked herself in her cabin to wither away and die. Charlie's agitation was palpable when he heard me laugh off his elaborate fairy tale as if it was a lousy joke. "We'll see who's laughing after we go through with the ritual tomorrow," Charlie said, clearly annoyed by my antics. "A ritual? What are you, 12? That is the dumbest fucking thing I have ever heard," I retorted, still egging him on. I'd gotten him going by that point. Charlie spent the next 10 minutes describing the ritual he'd learned about from his stoner cousin, Jerry, in great detail. I didn't take his tall tale very seriously. Jerry was 37 and lived in his mom's basement, after all. In hindsight, I should have. According to Charlie, the legend says that if you drive for exactly 27 minutes on Lost Hollow Road at 1:13 a.m., your car will stall. At that point, you need to exit your vehicle and walk westward through the woods for 3 miles. At precisely 2:44 a.m., you'll reach the cabin of the Witherer. Don't stop walking until you reach the dwelling. Once you arrive, you are to knock on the door twice before turning around the way you came, as if you were leaving. You don't actually leave, though. Instead, a voice will beckon you inside. Upon entering, the Witherer will ask you to solve a riddle. If you answer the riddle correctly, you get to make a wish, and no matter how absurd the wish is, it will come true. Marching through the woods in search of ghosts was not my idea of a fun Saturday night, but I didn't want to see Charlie get mauled by a bear either. I let out a sigh, and against my better judgment, I agreed. Fine. I'll go with you, but only so you don't have to trek around the woods alone at odd hours. The obnoxious ringing of the lunch bell cut our conversation short, and after shaking Charlie's hand to seal the deal, I headed off to my afternoon classes. I spent the rest of chemistry and physics daydreaming about what I would wish for if the ritual was legitimate. Would I wish for an endless fortune? A movie star wife? Fame? On the off chance the Witherer turned out to be real, she could grant me any of those. The next day flew by as I concocted my exact wish and read up on different riddles. I also spent over an hour peering at various maps, trying to find Lost Hollow Road. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find it anywhere. I concluded that it must be one of the many unmarked gravel roads going up into the mountains. When the time to pick up Charlie finally rolled around, he emerged from his house with a bulky camera, presumably to take a picture of the fabled cabin in the woods. Jerry said it was this one, Charlie said, pointing to a road highlighted red on his map. This confirmed my suspicion. It was indeed a mountain road and was also most likely private property. We pulled up to the unmarked, gravel road at 1:02 a.m. and cut off the motor to wait. Eventually, we got to talking about what we'd wish for. Charlie said he'd wish to be richer than Bill Gates and monopolized the next 10 minutes describing how he'd spend his billions. His rambling left me no time to tell him about my wish, but I let it go because mine wasn't anywhere near as interesting, anyway. At exactly 1:13 a.m., I began the drive down Lost Hollow Road. After around 10 minutes, the radio was cutting in and out. I chalked this up to the elevation and the dense forest canopy above. By the 15-minute mark, my headlights were flickering in and out, and I became worried that we'd have to turn around. I could barely see the road. Despite this strange mechanical malfunction, we pressed on down the ever-narrowing road. After a few more minutes of driving, it was clear that turning around wasn't an option anymore. I can't say for sure, but each time the lights went out I swear I could see erratic, jerky movements ahead of me. Charlie was becoming restless by the 20-minute mark. The condition of the road was getting worse at a rapid pace. It was crystal clear to both of us that nobody used this road anymore, let alone high school kids in Honda Civics. Maybe we should turn back, he suggested in a crestfallen tone. And just where do you suggest I do that, you moron? Which side of the mountain do you want me to drive off? I snapped at him. After the harsh scolding, Charlie began smoldering quietly in the passenger seat. Despite being mad as hell at the situation we were in, I pressed on, ignoring that reptilian-like sense of self-preservation ingrained in us all. I continued braving the winding, crater-ridden road for a few more moments before my car stalled and came to a halt in the middle of the road. A quick check of my watch revealed that, to my absolute horror, 27 minutes had passed since we started down the road. Charlie got out of the car and began walking into the tree line. Something wasn't adding up. The ritual was working too well. Are you insane? I yelled at him, petrified at the prospect of following him. He didn't answer and instead continued to wander deeper into the woods. With great reluctance, I followed suit. As we ventured blindly into the pitch-black forest, I could tell right away there was something wrong with the place. No animals or insects were making noise. Instead, there was only an eerie hum that befell the entire forest. After what felt like forever, my heart sank as a derelict-looking cabin appeared in the maze of trees. The orange hue of a candle illuminated the one window as we crept towards it. "There it is!" Charlie shouted. Charlie lifted his camera and snapped a quick photo of the cabin before stuffing the Polaroid in his pocket. "It is real," I thought to myself as I swallowed hard and tried to muster up every drop of courage in my body. This time it was me who wandered forward. Checking my watch yet again in the candlelight radiating from the window, I saw that it was now 2:44 a.m. It was now or never. Without missing a beat, I gave the door 2 firm knocks with my open palm before turning around to see Charlie staring onwards, slack-jawed. "You may enter," an ancient-sounding voice hissed at us from inside. Charlie and I lurched through the threshold in abject terror. The interior of the one-room cabin was plain and otherwise unremarkable, except for the single chair in the center. A dim, lone candle stood next to the chair, illuminating all but the corners of the structure. For the life of me, I couldn't tell which corner of the room the voice came from. I couldn't help but retch at the horrible stench. The stench of sulfur and rotting meat tickled my nostrils as the disembodied voice spoke again. "Sit, and answer well." Before I could react, Charlie pushed me aside and sat in the chair. He scanned the room anxiously as a dark, thin figure emerged from the shadows. The figure that emerged from the shadows and stood before Charlie was once human but wasn't anymore. She was rotten, her flesh melted from her bones. What remained of her ancient skin clung to her fragile bones like plastic wrap. Where her eyes should have been, there were dark, eyeless caverns. The Witherer is real, I thought, overwhelmed by a sick sense of dread and anticipation. "Make your wish, but do not speak it. Answer true, and I shall grant it," the Witherer rasped. The room froze in silence for a moment before she rasped yet again, "I am lovely in the sun but wilt when left in the dark, what am I?" Charlie looked onwards in shock before letting out a cackle and saying, seriously, "That's the infamous riddle." I took in the pungent air and breathed a deep sigh of relief. "A flower," Charlie decreed proudly. In that instant, Charlie's confident sneer twisted into a look of sheer agony as he collapsed to the floor, writhing in agony as his teeth fell from his mouth. His nails were next to go as they slid from his fingers. Next, his flesh blackened with lesions that oozed pus and thick, black blood. Finally, his flesh turned to a liquid and dripped from his bones in chunks. I froze and watched in horror as my best friend withered away into a heap of human sludge. I knew then that Charlie guessed wrong, and I only hoped I could guess correctly. Within a few seconds, nothing remained of Charlie except a pile of gruel and bone. My heart raced as I prepared myself to die as best I could. The Witherer turned to me next and asked the same riddle that sealed Charlie's gruesome fate. To this day I couldn't tell you what force compelled me to say it, but before I could even think of an answer I blurted out, "The Witherer." The agonizing death that I was awaiting never came. Instead, the world around me went cold and black. The force of slamming into the wooden floor woke me up, and I frantically scanned my surroundings. But, instead of the Witherer's cabin, I was in a normal-looking bedroom, laying on a hardwood floor. To my surprise, I wasn't dead yet. There was no pungent odor, no pile of remains, or any whispering crones. I had no idea where I was, but thankful to be alive. Instead, There was the smell of freshly cooked bacon and the soft voice of a woman calling out from downstairs, "Charlie, breakfast is ready." My heart skipped a beat as I remembered Charlie with his camera as I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crinkled-up photograph of a dimly lit cabin in the forest. At that moment, I knew. I knew that I answered correctly and gotten my wish. I was now the most popular kid in school. To this day, I'm still not sure if the hardest part of being Charlie is actually living his life or if it was seeing my own missing persons posters plastered around town. So, take it from someone who has been living a lie for the past 23 years, never go looking for the witherer. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.